Hello, and we're going to start a new topic, an entirely new topic this week. We're going to be looking at really kind of moving into the final phase of the course here. And of course, we've been moving largely chronologically. And now we're looking at, I guess, what you would call a mature British North America. It's not yet an industrial society, but we'll see some industrialization. It's not yet an urban society, but we'll see some urbanization. And we'll see some modern themes emerging in terms of class and in terms of racial identities as well. So these are all going to come together in a discussion today on the emergence of towns, and I guess we would call urbanization, and kind of class cultures in those towns. But we're also going to add here a discussion of Indigenous people. And this both does and doesn't work here. It's obviously not a related topic, but it works because it offers us a nice contrast. And in this discussion, and in the other discussion you're going to have from me as a lecture in this module, we'll be looking at other issues related to the kind of new politics that are emerging in the middle of the 19th century in British North America. This image is a print of a woolen factory near Waterloo, Ontario. And it's not a big factory, it's a relatively small thing, but it is a marker of where things going, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But it's a nice image that shows us a move away from kind of that pioneer settler on the land, building the farm kind of thing that we've seen in the past, to something newer and more modern and certainly more industrial. So we're going to cover a fair bit of ground. We're going to look at kind of quickly the country and the city, just a kind of picture of industrial and urban society emerging. We'll look at how that's impacting families and kind of creating class divisions in the society. And then we're going to look at a response to that, a political response to that, a very, very important one, and it very much informs the readings that you're going to have in your forum this week. Then we shift gears and we look at Indigenous people, and we'll look at, well, that's quite the word, euthanasia. Of course, euthanasia means mercy killing, if you will. And that's kind of the way British and increasingly Canadian political officials viewed Indigenous people at the time, that they would allow them to kind of die out peacefully, that they would euthanize the population. Not in an active sense, not that they would try to actively kill people, but certainly that they weren't going to do much to help them either. We'll talk a bit more of that as we go. Then we'll look at the Bagot Commission, 1842, a very important moment where kind of Indian policy, as it comes to be known, is set. And that's going to lead to residential schools. And that'll be our final pickup. And what I really want to do in this in this section here is kind of show you some emerging dynamics in town and country, and some responses to that. And then the contrast with Indigenous people is really interesting, because while there's lots of problems that we'll see, for example, with immigrant populations, Irish populations, for example, coming into the city, immigrating into British North America at the time, they're certainly poor, they're certainly not doing well. The contrast is still great with Indigenous people, and that's a useful perspective for us to have as we go forward. So one of the things we see a lot of in this time period is increasingly mechanized agriculture, and you're seeing a lot of discussion and coverage, advertising of agricultural implements. Also, a lot of discussion by agricultural improvers. Improvers are the people that want to modernize agriculture at the time. Britain is a leading agricultural economy, and certainly British North American elites certainly urge upon ordinary farmers that they take up kind of the progressive modernizing impulses of British farmers. And machinery is a very important part of that. And of course, machinery is made by machines. It's made in industry. To some extent, it's made by the blacksmith down the road. But increasingly with time, more and more that's becoming a factory kind of production. And of course, Britain and the United States are way ahead of Canada on that kind of industrial development. But you're beginning to see it here in Canada in the middle of the 19th century. Here's a mowing and reaping manufacturer in Montreal, taking British and American models and making them in Montreal. And you've seen these throughout the British North American countryside, from Nova Scotia all the way beginning to see a bit in Manitoba by this point in time. She's also seeing industry in the countryside, and with the greater productive capacity that machinery gives you in agriculture, it also means that you can produce more and manufacture more. So one of the things you're beginning to see at this time period, and this again, that woolen factory in Waterloo, Ontario, in that opening slide, here's one in Prince Edward Island, in Tryon, Prince Edward Island. And again, what this is pointing to is increasing numbers of farmers who are going way beyond that kind of simple subsistence stage of just producing enough to feed their families, and are producing for the market, and are producing to sell their goods on a market. And wool is a good example of that. You can sell that to a woolen mill. They'll weave that. They'll make blankets and things like clothing out of that, cloth out of that. And of course, that's a form of manufacturing. It's a very simple, very early form of manufacturing, but it's a form of manufacturing. And in British North America at this time, this is new and is really changing the countryside. Those changes show different effects on different people. And we tend to think of agricultural communities as being relatively equal, and certainly to some extent, perhaps more equal than urban societies, but not equal by any stretch of the imagination. And I've got two PEI examples here of two farms with really completely, distinctly different possibilities. One's a kind of hard scrabble, barely subsistence kind of farm. You can see it's in pretty rough shape. One is a prosperous farm, certainly of an improving farmer, the kind of farmer that believed in the market and expanding through the use of machinery. You can see he's using a mowing machine on what looks like an oat, or actually probably a wheat field there in the foreground. But he's got cattle, he's got sheep. And this shows all the marks of prosperity. And in fact, the fact that we have this drawing of the farm is an indicator of his prosperity. He's showing up in a book published about Prince Edward Island in the mid-19th century. And this is therefore meant to be kind of a model farm. But really what I want you to see here is kind of an emergence of class, even in agricultural societies, that there are poor people and there are rich people. Not rich on a global imperial scale, but they're doing very well, thank you very much. The poor people aren't doing well, and so that creates class in the countryside. But it's also important for us to keep in mind that those people won't stay in the countryside. Most of them will lose their land. Most of them won't be able to pay to keep up the mortgage payments, to improve their farms. They'll fall into debt once they have children that they need to divide the properties amongst and so on. Typically, they'll end up selling that property or kind of barely eking out an existence there. But certainly, selling it off to a larger, more prosperous farmer is a more likely scenario. That larger, more prosperous farmer can pass that land on to one of his sons to create their own farm with some capital that could become a more prosperous farm, or actually to expand their own holdings. So one of the other things you're seeing in agriculture at this time period is increasing farm size as people buy more land to increase their own individual production. There's all kinds of social indicators that we can look at in this time period. I want to point to this one in particular. It's a really interesting one. I think these numbers will surprise most people. This is the age of first marriage, and first marriage is important because it means that, well, very few people divorcing, but certainly people dying, and they're having second marriage. This is their first marriage, and these are the average ages of farmers at about 1865 in British North America. Look at those ages. I don't know about you, but many people I've talked to over the years imagine 19th century farmers marrying at 18, the girls marrying at 14, and that kind of thing. It's not really happening at all. And that's related to what's happening in the economy, in the farm economy. Those larger, more prosperous farms tend to be passed on to sons. And women in those communities who want to marry some of those more prosperous sons, they're going to delay their marriage. The sons are going to delay their marriage because they want to come into that farm before they'll actually marry, because it's a way of establishing a household on a surer footing. And women, well, naturally will follow the same kind of tact, but of course they will delay their own marriages, their own strategic choices on who they'll marry based on their ability to access one of these more prosperous farms. You can see this as a dramatic indication of changing class positions in the countryside. If we look at other social groups, look at professionals. Professionals are people like lawyers, doctors, and so on. they're very similar in the ages in terms of the age of first marriage as the farmers. But look at ordinary laborers, much less, much lower numbers, much lower ages of first marriage, and that's a clear indication that they are that property concerns aren't as much. Professionals have to get that education before they'll marry. The farmer has to develop that farm or be old enough to inherit that farm before they'll marry. Laborers, property considerations aren't there. They can marry really quite young. So laborers are marrying 5, 6, 7 years younger than on average than farmers and professionals. So capital and the role of capital in these people's lives, whether it's educational, the cost of having an education, or the cost of developing a farm, that kind of capital is making a difference for people. So what's going on there? Demographic pressures are encouraging people to delay marriage, raising that age of marriage, but it also, of course, pushes out migration, because not all of those people are going to find that prosperous situation. Even prosperous farmers may not want to divide up their farms, so they look for ways to provide education for their middle children and youngest children and so on. And oftentimes that means getting them an education, but often sending them elsewhere to find work. And of course, this is going to become a political issue in all of the colonies in the middle of the 19th century, because of course outmigration means the colonies begin to lose people. And from a demographic perspective, that's bad, but also from a community perspective, that's really bad, because it means people are kind of looking around their own communities and saying, we're losing people. We can't keep our own people in our own communities, and that's a bad thing. So how do we change that? What can we do in our communities, but also in kind of in the levels of politics and economic policy? What can we do to foster conditions that will encourage people to stay longer? So these will become discussions in the middle of the 19th century. The family itself becomes a kind of locus for discussion as well. And you see tons of advice columns emerging in newspapers at the time. This is just one I've pulled out. This is from the 1830s. And it's just kind of giving advice to men and women, to how do they think about marriage, how to think about property, how to think about these considerations in their lives. And all kinds of scientific advice emerging, on, as I say here, for farmers, for family formation, for the modern woman. How can a woman conduct herself properly? And if the stability of the society is in question, new questions will be raised about how one conducts oneself in that situation. So newspapers and other kind of intellectual forming figures in the communities will try to take the lead, try to influence kind of views on that side. And of course they're picking up on newspaper pieces and magazine pieces written in Great Britain and the United States as well. So you're seeing kind of a confluence of ideas showing up in these colonial papers, but very much responding to local concerns. What's affecting us locally, and how do we think about that? By far the biggest indicator of those changes, though, is in the growth of cities. And I don't have statistics for all of these cities. I could only find population figures from the 1840s for Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax. But look at this from 1841 to 1871. And come back and look at this later if you want to. But you can certainly see significant growth in the cities. By 1871, Montreal has 100,000 people, which of course isn't big by our standards today, but it represents more than a doubling since 1841. So you're seeing expansion, you're seeing pressures on people, and of course also infrastructure issues emerging there as well. But certainly growth is part of that. Many of these people are immigrants coming from Great Britain, coming from sometimes other places as well, but this time mostly Great Britain, mostly Scotland in fact. But a lot of them are internal migrants as well, people coming from the countryside. And if those rural communities are losing people, they're losing them to places like Halifax, to places like Montreal, to places like Toronto. Cities are growing. They're also losing them to the United States, which is yet another issue. But certainly you're seeing part of that growth, part of that migration moving into the cities, and the cities growing correspondingly. So we know about some big cities like Toronto. Toronto's not the biggest city in today it is, but it's not the biggest city in the 19th century. But it's certainly growing really rapidly. And here's a nice illustration from 1854 of Toronto, Canada West. Certainly you can see it expanding. You can certainly see some smokestacks from factories off in the distance there. Lots of church steeples, a very busy waterfront. It's not as big a city as Montreal at this point. Won't overtake it until well into the 20th century. But certainly it's a thriving, prosperous city and it's doing very well. It's certainly become not only the political center of Upper Canada, but the economic hub of Upper Canada as well. But smaller cities, and I think St. John's a great example of this. I mean, in terms of like the smaller places in the Maritimes and so on, everybody would know something about Halifax. St. John is actually a very significant city in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It thrives on the timber industry in this time period. It's one of the most prosperous places in British North America. It's growing rapidly in this time period. It will begin to decline not until into the 20th century. Decline, it will continue to grow, but it won't have that rapid growth that it was having in the 19th century like the other cities. So the other cities will certainly overtake it in the late 19th and early 20th century, but it's doing very well at this time period, prospering, as I said, particularly on the timber trade. With these new cities come all kinds of problems. And these are cities, these are largely wooden cities, and we're in a cold country, so we burn a lot of stuff, and we're also beginning to burn coal, which burns quite a bit hotter than wood burns. One of the problems that emerges from this is fires. Fires are a problem across North America. Major cities like New York and Chicago have fires, but of course in British North America it's exactly the same. Here's a major fire in St. John in 1877, one in Quebec City in 1845, another one in Toronto in 1849, another one in Montreal in 1852. And these are big fires. These are not wooden buildings with coal. They're gonna catch fire and they're gonna burn whole areas of cities. Here's a fire in Montreal in 1852. It destroys 20% of the housing in the city. Imagine if St. Catharines lost 20% of its housing. We'd be talking about a huge swath of St. Catharines burning in a fire. So this would be a serious blow to an already stressed city, a city that's already in having difficulties in bringing immigrants into it as it is. To suddenly lose 20% of its housing would deal a serious blow to many people and their fortunes. And certainly you need to find ways to deal with these emerging urban problems at the time. Toronto has a big fire as well. This is St. James Cathedral. The arrow is pointing to it here. And they built in the early 1830s. Here it is pictured on King Street in 1835. It burns in 1849. Not just the church, several blocks of the city burn in 1849. And St. James is the cathedral is one of the buildings that's completely destroyed in that fire. These fires have major impacts on cities. They destroy large portions of the city, and they are probably the most feared element of urban life at the time. Another urban hazard, disease. Outbreaks of disease in these dirty areas where there's no sewage yet, where the water contamination is extraordinary, where just public health in general has no infrastructure in place to really deal with this. And so certainly outbreaks of cholera, outbreaks of dysentery, sexually transmitted disease has become a serious problem in the mid-19th century, particularly so in Quebec City and Montreal, Quebec City and Halifax as two port cities. And port cities are notoriously casual. There's certainly lots of prostitution in port cities like that, imperial port cities like Quebec and Halifax. Lots of naval shipmen coming into those places. And so certainly there's a lot of problems with outbreaks of disease, dirty water, and sewage issues in these cities. So developing the infrastructure to deal with these things, very difficult, very expensive. And also absolutely simply necessary as the population grows. So these are urgent, pressing issues for urban government, but also, of course, for the colonial governments because they have to find ways to finance all of this in the middle of the 19th century. We saw a class emerging in the countryside, classes emerging in the towns, the cities as well. We certainly see this in immigrant neighborhoods where the poor simply arriving with nothing, often with no money whatsoever, often with no work, no prospects for employment, often with no skills. So you see residential class divisions emerging in the towns very quickly in the 19th century. And a lovely example, it's a drawing from the 1870s of a poor house in Montreal in the 1870s. But the photograph on the left-hand side is a picture of not rich housing by any stretch of the imagination, but respectable working men, probably some professionals, lawyers, doctors might live in housing like this, people who own small businesses. That would be the kind of housing they would live in. Not rich, but prosperous and comfortable lives being lived. Very nearby, because of course these cities aren't that big yet, very nearby there would be whole neighborhoods of people living in utter destitute poverty. And that's going to become a problem. And again, think of those diseases. If you're prosperous living beside somebody who's poor, and you know that the rate of disease is greater in those poor neighborhoods, you don't want to go anywhere near those poor neighborhoods. And so what you're also beginning to see in this time period, and just beginning, this is going to take off in the 20th century really, but you're beginning to see people move into the suburbs. And the suburbs of these large cities are practically downtown today, but they're moving away from those poorer neighborhoods, those disease-infested neighborhoods in the working class districts of the city. Also seeing tremendous social problems caused by immigration, and some immigrants in particular. And again, we've talked about this in past weeks, but the issue of how the Irish integrate into British North American society is always a significant issue. This is an American illustration, not a Canadian one. It's from New York City in 1871. But there are riots in St. John, New Brunswick, in Quebec City, in Ottawa, in Toronto, all throughout the 19th century. Riots between orange and green, between the Protestant British Irish settlers and the green Irish Catholic settlers of the same time period. And by riots, I mean riots. We see wars in the streets. St. John, New Brunswick, for example, has several riots in the 1840s and 1850s where literally battles are fought on the streets between these rival groups. And they really attempt to kind of control politics, job access, all kinds of basic functions of what happens in a city in those time periods is trying to be influenced by these groups. So these are all kinds of problems, right? And dealing with these problems is significant. And certainly the state will take on a big part of that. But what we're also seeing in this time period are people themselves trying to find solutions to these. And that's where I want to turn now, is to talk about civil society. When we talk about civil society, we're talking about areas of society that don't fall within the private sphere, meaning not the sphere of individuals, but don't fall within the public sphere of business and the state either. It's somewhere in the middle. And really what civil society is about is people coming together in groups around common causes, common issues, things that they share in common. So today we have, Lions clubs and Masons and people who engage in fraternal societies and who oftentimes have general community-oriented interests. Or they may be raising money for the poor or for women or for cancer research, any number of kinds of issues that they might mobilize around. This is really it's an 18th century in its origins, maybe even to some extent the 17th century, but it's taking off in the 19th century as a powerful social force. And it's part of life in an emerging democracy. It's where people are recognizing problems and looking for ways that they can help themselves solve those problems and realizing that collectively they can do more than individually. So an obvious expression of this are the kinds of Irish immigrant societies that form in cities across British North America in this time period. Here's one from Montreal, the St. Patrick's Benevolent Society. It's a Catholic Irish society. And it's providing, as this indicates, the practical working of mutual benefits for its members. So if a working father becomes sick, they'll provide some financial support to the family. Or if the father dies, they'll perhaps pay for the funeral or things like that. Ways to provide support to the broader community who may need that support. And it also provides a way of providing a kind of paternalistic politics as well, because what it often too means, while it obviously just has a kind of mutualistic benefit, it often has a political dimension too, in the sense that oftentimes the elite members of these groups will become the leaders and will exert political influence in that manner. So if I'm a rich Irish Catholic, I'm giving money to this society, paying for people's funerals. And it means that I'm a kind of benefactor. It means that everybody's a benefactor because they're all paying into it. They're all paying dues. They're all paying some kind of support for the society. But some, of course, will pay more and will get more influence because of that. And so these become important vehicles both for democratic self-governance, in the sense that people are picking up their own concerns and trying to solve those problems. but also in some ways mobilizing people for leadership within those communities, so they become political as well. But they're certainly very, very important, and we see them all through North America. Orange Lodge, one of the most famous of these. That's the British Protestant group. Orange because of the association with William of Orange, Protestant leader. Irish Benevolent Society, the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization, the Masonic Lodge, the agricultural societies. These are not so much fraternal organizations, but they are certainly mutual aid societies where they're looking to find ways in communities to improve agriculture, to have better seed sources, better animals, breeding stock, giving lectures on new agricultural techniques and so on. Again, so individuals within communities trying to help each other in that kind of fashion. Mechanics institutes in the 19th century where sometimes leading figures, but also sometimes fairly ordinary people in communities would give lectures on topics that they have some expertise in. And these would range from kind of popular science and kind of almost an entertainment kind of fashion, but also much more practical things of how to save your money, how to get a mortgage for your house, how to somehow raise yourself up in the world. A lot of this is about self-help, finding ways to help people raise themselves up in the world. And at a time when lots of people are deadly poor and living in quite miserable conditions in these deteriorating cities, these kinds of societies provide real support and sometimes real hope for people. So I want to shift gears completely here and talk about Indigenous peoples in this same time period and talk about some of the significant shifts they're encountering at this time. We can talk about two in particular as being particularly important. First of these is the demographic shift. The populations of the settler components of all these colonies is growing rapidly, much more rapidly than Indigenous peoples' populations. In fact, Indigenous populations seem to be declining in this time period. Certainly they have declined historically over the past couple of centuries through the introduction of disease, but now they're also facing just being out-personed on the land. As settlers move onto the land, as farmers expand, as those farms get bigger, increasingly there's less and less land available for Indigenous people, and therefore they have less access to fish and game and to the traditional ways they've found subsistence. The second thing we can point to is a political shift in how Indigenous people were viewed by the British colonial imperial policymakers. Up to and including the War of 1812, Indigenous people had been critical allies of the British in the 7 Years' War, in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812. Indigenous people play a critical military role. We saw this in our brief discussion of the War of 1812, where Brock really understood that his most valuable troops were Indigenous people. They were the ones he could trust the most and the ones that he thought had the most talents for warfare in colonial circumstances. After the War of 1812, and in the subsequent decades after that, it becomes clear that the United States and Great Britain are trying to do everything they can to normalize relations between the two countries, or between the colonies and the United States. And what that means is that increasingly, in the people who are looking at policy making in the colonies, increasingly Indigenous people play a smaller and smaller role in their thinking. So in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, up to the War of 1812, they're thinking about Indigenous people. By the 1830s, 40s, 50s, increasingly they're not. Increasingly they're viewing Indigenous people as a social problem more than allies, more than as compatriots. And of course, the reason they're seeing them as a social problem is because of the first point. Indigenous people are increasingly not able to provide their own subsistence. So they're increasingly relying on the state for support. So these two things are working in concert and causing an outcome which is, of course, exasperating the problem for Indigenous people, because, of course, the more they get ignored, still less access they're going to have to fish and game and so on. The state does come up with some new policies, and they entertain all kinds of notions, but they come up with some basic ideas. First of these is that they think that you should concentrate the Indigenous populations. And by concentrate them, what they want to do is bring together kind of smaller villages, smaller, more dispersed peoples, and bring them together on reserved lands. And of course, we speak of Indian reserves today. That's where this idea is coming from. They're going to create pockets of land that they will reserve for indigenous peoples and require them to live there, require them to stay on that land. And of course, what they're doing is trying to contain indigenous populations, because they're also concerned that, certainly settlers are concerned that indigenous people, because they move about a lot, because they migrate from place to place, will hunt game that the settlers might want, hunt the cattle that the farmer might be raising, because of course when they can't find deer, they'll perhaps hunt something else. So there's all kinds of concerns that indigenous people need to be contained. They need to concentrate the population in that kind of fashion. There's also a concern to educate indigenous people, and this comes under a whole range of possibilities, but the most famous application of this and the simplest application of this was this kind of notion of the Bible and the plow. And the Bible and the plow points to the Bible as a civilizing force, to Christianize these people, to teach them Western ways, to urge them to assimilate into white settler society. And the plow is that kind of basic technique. If you teach them to farm, they can better assimilate. So these are kind of two planks of assimilating indigenous people. Christianize them and teach them to farm, and that will become the policy of the Bible and the plow. The third one is, as I say here, to economize. And what does that mean? That means to do it as cheaply as possible. So they're certainly also looking for ways to pull money out of support for indigenous people. In the 18th and early 19th century, the British government had been willing to spend a fair bit of money in supporting indigenous people because they saw them as valuable. As their value in British policy eyes declines, their willingness to spend that money declines as well. So the British state is looking for ways to cheapen those costs. And of course, the colonial state, as it begins to pick up more and more of those costs, they too will look for ways to economize as well. So they're trying to concentrate them, they're trying to assimilate them, and they're trying to economize them. But of course, the problem is that those first two things cost money, and the second one in particular can cost a fair bit of money if you're going to do it well. They won't ever really do it well, but it could cost a lot of money if you were to try to do it well. And the third one says, no, we want to spend less money doing it. So we got some policies in tension here. And again, you're seeing indigenous people unable to carve their own futures, to govern themselves in this process, because they're losing their own ability to feed themselves and look after themselves in these changing circumstances. All kinds of efforts begin in the 18th century. Well, as we saw them in the French period, they begin in the 17th century. But in the British North American context, they begin in the late 18th century, begin to take off in the 19th century with attempts to civilize indigenous people, to assimilate indigenous people, mostly through religious instruction. So part of the most basic aims there is to translate the Bible into indigenous languages and to train indigenous missionaries to get in amongst those people and to try to convert those people. Some of them are very successful. Some of the best known missionaries of the 19th century are either indigenous or people who spend most of their lives living with indigenous people, and certainly in some ways become part of those indigenous communities. One of the most famous of these guys is this guy here, Peter Jones, who is a product of a mixed marriage, and he comes from a missionary background, and he's a person who spends a large part of his life trying to convince the state, the British state, the colonial state, to support these efforts, and then on the other hand also spends a large part of his life trying to encourage his fellow indigenous people to accept Christianity. And he has really mixed results on both fronts. And certainly you could argue that because he's not getting especially good state and political support, that may explain his mixed results in bringing people to Christianity. You can also make the obvious reply to that, which is that many indigenous people are simply saying no. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at that problem, they were still going to refuse. And of course that gets at who these people are, how they conceive of themselves, and how they're trying to continue to to continue to forge independent existences in this world. When you get to your readings, note the really interesting position Peter Jones takes on indigenous education, of indigenous youth. and think of his own children there. In the 1830s and 1840s, the state begins to build Indigenous day schools. These are schools much like the schools being built for settler families throughout the colonies. They're built in, they're not building hundreds of them like they are for the settler families, but they're building a couple of dozen around the colony. And their attempts to try to bring basic levels of education, of reading and writing to Indigenous people. They're not especially successful. Some Indigenous people, some Indigenous families want their kids to go to these schools. Sometimes the kids want to be there, but not often. And so certainly there's problems with keeping the kids there, keeping their attention, keeping their interest, and developing a kind of sustained education. Certainly there's some notable successes, but in large part, most Indigenous kids in particular, but even the families, resist the kind of imposed education that they seem to be getting in these schools. And it's important to understand that lots of Indigenous people understood that there was value in these schools. What they didn't like was the way it was happening. So lots of Indigenous leaders, for example, were saying things like, yes, I understand that our people need to know how to farm, teach us how to farm. But they didn't necessarily want it to be Christianized at the same time. But of course, for these schools, it was often part of a common package. So rather than have their culture destroyed, people wouldn't learn the agriculture. And so there was a clear resistance, a real kind of active resistance on the part of Indigenous people to these schools. This changes dramatically in 1842 with the passing of the Bagot Commission in 1842. The Bagot Commission is named after this man, Charles Bagot, who's the governor of Canada between 1841 and 1843. And he writes a report investigating Indigenous peoples and the problems of governance of Indigenous peoples in this time period. In his report, he goes back to the Royal Proclamation, and we've talked about the Royal Proclamation before, but really, really quickly, I'll just mention again, the Royal Proclamation guarantees and recognizes, acknowledges the right of occupancy of Indigenous people west of the Appalachian Mountains, and this map nicely illustrates that. And in effect says that Indigenous people have legitimate property claims to all of this territory. They have rights that the British state needs to acknowledge and needs to deal with. Second thing is that not only do they have rights, but they deserve compensation for any kind of the surrender of land that would take place. In other words, if settlers are going to move on to this land, the British state needs to acknowledge Indigenous rights of occupation and therefore compensate them for the loss of that land. Bagot sees this as legitimate, but he views it also as a way to achieve an end that he thinks is desirable. And what he really wants to do is get Indigenous people out of their focus on communal ownership of land and move them into individual ownership of land. And there's certainly a kind of anthropology going on here. They're certainly believing that individual property ownership will be part of a package that will teach these people to look after themselves as individuals, not as communities, but as individuals. And so he looks for ways to extinguish Indian title through the legitimate processes outlined in the Royal Proclamation, but to push them away from communal organization and ownership of that property and into individual property. So he's looking for ways to try to achieve this. He also developed some criteria for looking at who is an Indian. And he determines a kind of biological determination of status, that it's going to be through blood quantum that will determine whether a person is an Indian or not, and therefore is entitled to be treated under this policy. He also looks at an idea of ending presence. Presence is a bit complicated. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but we saw this during the treaty negotiations, that there would be present exchanges. And over the course of the 18th and 19th century, those presents became increasingly big. And in many ways, you could argue that what Indigenous people were demanding was suitable compensation for the roles they were playing in these colonial wars. And presence became part of the treaty process and part of the required acknowledgement of that ongoing relationship with the British Crown. It's getting expensive. Again, this goes back to this economizing policy. And Bagot looks for ways to end this. So he thinks if we can give them money up front and get them on individual plots of land, we can end communal ownership and end the presence at the same time. The big innovation, though, certainly the most important one he will introduce, is this one. He recommends that they shift from day schools to residential schools. Schools that I mentioned earlier, from 1830 to 1842. Kids get up in the morning, they eat breakfast. I don't know if they eat breakfast or not, but they go off to school. They attend school for the day, they come home at the end of the day. Bagot argues this will never work. And in fact, many of the Indigenous people looking at education in the British Empire, around the British Empire, also argue that this will never work. You need to take the children out of the communities. They point out, rightly, that these kids, when they go home at night, they revert to their Indigenous languages. They listen to their elders. They imbibe the spirit of collective ownership of the property and the resources all around them. In other words, they remain part of the Indigenous culture, even if they're receiving a Western education. And so Bagot reasons that the only way to strip people of this culture is to take them right out of that culture. It's a barbaric idea. It makes sense. It makes sense from a Western perspective that you would want to teach them these liberal ways. But of course, it's a barbaric practice because really it means that you're disrupting families, you're taking children out of families, you're forcing them to go to school, you're holding them prisoner in effect. You're saying to families, if you need, for example, if you need support, food support for your family, the state does this routinely in the 19th century. Send your children to the school and we'll give you support. Pull your kid out of the school and we will cut off your support. So for families that are dependent on this kind of support, are utterly vulnerable, this becomes a big stick to beat these families with. And of course the result is the kind of horrible situation that emerges in Canada in the 20th century. Here it is being born in 1842. It won't become massively systematized until later in the 19th century. But over the course of the late 19th century and into the 20th, it won't end until the 1950s and 60s in some provinces. These schools will be designed to beat Indian culture out of Indigenous people, to turn them into white people. But really what it does is punish them for being white people, for being Indigenous people. And very few of them successfully make that transition. To what can we owe that? Well, we can owe that mostly to kids who still saw value in their families, who still saw value in their cultures, who felt nothing but denigration at the hands of these schools, who felt nothing but humiliation at the hands of these people. And so they grow up both proudly clinging to their culture and yet also beaten down by being told over and over and over again that it was an inferior culture. Really remarkable story, and one that the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission has, I think quite rightly, labeled cultural genocide. It really is an attempt to destroy a culture. It really is an attempt to make, through coercive means, something disappear, a culture disappear. And that sounds like cultural genocide to me. We could have a discussion about that, but it sounds like cultural genocide to me. This will continue in the 1850s, 1860s. The Indian Act will be passed in this time period. You'll see acts for the gradual civilization of the Indian tribes in the Canadas. This is, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Canada West, Canada East. These acts are really, really interesting. They harbor the possibility of Indigenous people getting citizenship. Although it's interesting, they have to prove themselves. This is interesting. They have to prove that they are literate. They have to prove that they are sober, and they have to prove that they're not in debt. And that's really, really fascinating because it speaks to how white settler society viewed these people, because they have this onus placed on them to prove these things. White people don't have to prove these things. It's assumed that they are sober, literate, and not drunk. And that's patently not true. Most Most farmers in the 19th century are in debt. They have to be in debt. It's how you get ahead. It's you borrow money to make money. That's how businesses work. That's how farms work in the 19th century. Indigenous people will be punished for having a debt, even a small one. So grossly different criteria being applied to Indigenous people. It's important that we see that Indigenous people never accepted these terms. I could bring out hundreds of petitions like this to show you, but just a quick example. Indigenous people consistently pointing back to the treaties, saying, we made these arrangements with you. You are not honoring them. Seeking reparations, seeking compensation, seeking land, seeking access to the resources and means of subsistence that was promised to them in these treaties. Courts consistently, in the 19th century, consistently turned them down. Beginning in the 1940s, 50s, moving more so into the 70s and 80s, you begin to see significant changes in courts beginning to recognize the legitimacy of these treaty claims. But in the 19th century, not at all. The number of sympathetic hearings an Indigenous person will get in a court hearing in British North America, you can count on one hand. And we're talking about several hundred instances of attempts to petition courts to do something. And I want to raise a little sidebar issue here at the end of all this, and it relates to this. This is an era of increasing liberalization. This is an era of increasing democratization. This is an era when democratic freedoms and political rights are expanding in British North America. And yet, it's the reformers, it's the liberals, it's the Democrats in the 19th century who tend to be the most aggressive in pushing for the destruction of Indigenous people. And it tends to be the conservatives who are most willing to accommodate and find different ways of dealing with Indigenous people. This cartoon gets at a dimension of this. During the 1837 rebellions, liberal democratic rebellions, Indigenous people and African Americans sided with the British state, with the colonial governments. In other words, they did not support the rebellion. And you might think, liberals, they should support that. No, they didn't, because largely the conservatives were much more tolerant, much more willing to accommodate Indigenous people and African Americans, to provide some ability for these people to manage their way in colonial society than the liberals were. And so this is a cartoon mocking the governor for relying on dirty Indians and Negroes to support them. You can see the conservative politician holding up the sign, "Liberty for Negroes." And of course, this is a liberal saying, these are conservatives who are inappropriately courting a vulgar group of people perhaps who don't even have proper citizenship or have proper rights within a society. That'll change in the 20th century, of course. This political paradigm will shift dramatically, and liberals will become the people that support these Indigenous people, and conservatives will largely become the ones that don't. Not always, but often will become the ones that don't. But here in this era of reform, this is an important point for us to keep in mind. What the liberal Democrats are doing is trying to expand that liberal democratic tent. They're trying to get more people into that liberal democratic tent. Sorry, that tent is a metaphor. It's not a literal tent up there. But that kind of notion that you can bring more and more people into the fold. Indigenous people and African Americans don't fit into that. They are still excluded from that. Women are still excluded from that as well. And we'll pick up that issue of African Americans and women in our next discussion. But I want to set up that point just now and show you that in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it's conservatives who tend to be, not exclusively, I can point to lots of nasty racist conservatives in this time period, but generally speaking, they tend to be more tolerant of racial politics than liberals are. Some quick summary here. We're seeing lots of new pressures as the society grows. We're seeing lots of informal adjustments. Changing ages of marriage, so restrictions on families changing, migration in and out of the colonies, but families looking for ways to support themselves more effectively, often by sending their children away or children on their own deciding to go away. These are informal adjustments. There's also formal adjustments. The state is beginning to try to make some changes, trying to implement new infrastructure arrangements. The civil society organizations that are forming. These are formal responses to the problems that exist within these increasingly problematic urban societies. Similarly, we're seeing changed circumstances for First Nations people, but it's largely a kind of external change caused by the fact that they no longer have the kind of access to land that they once had, and no longer have that military significance that they once had. And that's changing their relationship with British North America. It means that British North American people, and the governments and states in particular, are changing the way they view these people. And in general, we can look at the middle of the 19th century and say, there's a lot of new pressures emerging here, a lot of changes coming down on society from all kinds of different directions, and are really pushing us toward more complex, more dynamic, and in many ways more dangerous, many ways more prosperous too, but also many ways more dangerous. I mean, think of those fires and those massive outbreaks of disease, and if you're an Indigenous person, just being completely marginalized in that society. So new possibilities, really new and exciting things happening, but also at the exact same time, major challenges for lots of people within British North American society.